Hi everyone, I'm Stuart Macliver, the co-founder and general partner of Amvest Terraden. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by Amvest Terraden titled Critical Minerals and Semiconductors, where circuits meet the dirt. Before we dive in, a quick disclaimer. This webinar is for informational purposes only and does not constitute an offer to sell or the solicitation of an offer to sell or buy any security. It should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. We are, in a short period of time, going to try to unpack the critical minerals that go into the production of semiconductors and chips. Do you know the difference between a semiconductor and a chip? Depending on the chip, there are between 20 to 50 distinct minerals that go into the production process when you include all dopants, structural metals, rare earths, specialty gases, and compounds. In the production phase, from mine to chip, there are hundreds of production process steps. You will see that it's going to be really hard to complete the unpack of this complicated industry in a short 30 to 40 minute session. You will also see how reliant this industry is on mining. And we focus on investments in companies producing, developing, and exploring for these important minerals. You don't just pick up a few microchips out of a bag of Doritos from Walmart. Every piece has come from a mine or a gas operation. In this discussion of semiconductors, first critical minerals, and the supply chain battle between the functioning West versus China, we will discuss the politics, the technology, the quid pro quo, the retaliation, the future. So now I'd like to pass it on to the presentation over to my colleague, Tomasz Nadrowski. Tomasz actually spent some time on a recent holiday in Taiwan to visit the TSMC foundry. Now that is a dedication you need to unpack this complex industry. Tomasz has also written a book on this space titled Mineral War: How China is Turning Strategic Metals into Weapons of Mineral Destruction. And I'll pass it over to Tomasz.
Thank you, Stuart, and thanks everyone for joining us today. This is a topic that is hardly ever tackled the way we're planning to do it today. Our ambition is to connect the production of semiconductors, or chips, better said, with the mining production. And of course, there are plenty of steps between the two. This slide takes you back to your high school, probably pleasant memories of the table of elements. And you see that 5 columns, column 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, contains what we consider intrinsic semiconductors. These are semiconductor elements, that is, elements that have both the characteristics of an insulator and a conductor. Most metals are conductors, but there are some other elements that are purely insulators. Of course, a lot of oxides, but also rubber or wood would fall into this category. And as you will see, we will actually talk today about quite a lot of different elements that go into the production of semiconductors, or better said, chips again. All the blue dots here will be mentioned in the presentation. And these are not the only elements that go into the chip production, because we left out, for example, the column on the right-hand side, which contains noble gases. And that's because they're not related to mining, but are created through fractional distillation of liquefied air. But there are important elements also contributing to the production of chips. Okay, so this year we have gone through several bumps in the relations between China and the rest of the world because of Chinese quasi-monopolization of several critical elements, as we usually refer to them, critical materials or critical minerals. On this chart, you see how dominant China is producing several of those. And that's sort of the life that we have to live in when we invest in critical minerals and mining in general. It's going to take a while for the West to rebuild those value chains, obviously. Now, if you look at the value chain in semiconductors, the situation is quite the opposite. Very little of the value added in this industry is created in China. Here on this chart, you see it about 6% in total. And most of the value added is in the foundry, in the fabrication, the fabs. And this is what we're mostly going to focus on today, because it relates to material science and those various materials that go into the fabrication. Now, If you look at it from perspective of types of different chips, China is actually quite strong in lower quality chips, so larger than 28 nanometer logic chips, and some of the discrete analog and optoelectronic products, so the second and third line here on this chart. However, Chinese producers of high-end chips below 10 nanometers are still quite behind the Western producers. Only about 2% of these are produced in China, and also of lower quality and much more power inefficient. And this is why it's important to remember that the production of those high-end chips is really dominated by these two companies. This is a picture of Renchuan Huang and Wei Zhejia, the CEOs of NVIDIA and TSMC respectively. But even with their leadership in production of high-end chips, so first hardware design on the NVIDIA side and on the TSMC side, the foundry, even that production will rely on a lot of materials. Okay, so before we get into the weeds of mining and production of these things, let's go briefly through what we're actually talking about, what kind of products are at the end here. So first, there are integrated circuits of three different types. The logic type, which is central processing unit, CPU, which is in every computer. The graphic processor unit, which is currently the object of that a pretty intense competition for artificial intelligence, because these processors can work rather than sequentially like CPUs in parallel. Then we have FPGAs, which are field programmable gate arrays. These are actually chips that once manufactured, they can still be reconfigured by customers for things like flight control of UAVs, for example, or satellites or medical devices and so on. And then ASICs, so application-specific integrated circuits. System companies like Amazon, Apple, or Alphabet specialized in designing these. Then we have the memory chips like DRAM or flash memory, and Korea is a dominant player here. Analog chips, they process and manipulate analog or natural phenomena, whether visual, oral, temperature, and translate them into digital data. And then we have optoelectronic integrated circuits that deal with both electronic and photonic material, and non-IC, so simple, discrete chips that usually perform just one role, say switching or amplifying. In case of sensors, will be just detection. In case of optoelectronics, detection or emission of a specific wavelength. This is how a normal chip looks. It's composed of a gate, dielectric, source, and drain. So gate is where the voltage is applied to generate electric current in the channel. The channel is made of silicon, usually. I'll talk about silicon in a moment. Gate, when the whole transistor business started, initially was made of aluminum. Then it went through a period that polysilicon was mostly used. Today, it's used with a variety of different metals. The so-called high-K metal gates, as you see, contains different metals. Dielectrics, which separates metal from the substrate, continues to be some oxide, silicon oxide, or hafnium dioxide, for example, today. And then source and drain, through which the current enters the channel and then exits. It turns to be doped with different ions of various materials, including some metals. And then we have interconnects between those different transistors. So the whole chip making, of course, takes a lot of different steps. First, we have design using electronic design automation. That's not what we're focusing on today, because this is this abstract part of the design and interface between software and hardware design. What's really important for us is transistor manufacturing, which is material heavy, and also equipment that's necessary to manufacture those wafers. The main processes, in a very kind of generic term, first depends on the preparation of the substrate, then the deposition of metals, pattern definition for lithography, etching, so removal of certain elements, doping, adding ions to the substrate of the wafer, and then of course the equipment for each of those steps. And these steps are repeated multiple times for a CPU. I think one wafer passes through lithography about 80 times. Overall, there are over 900 processes for a typical chip to go through. And this is just to scare you what we're going to talk about. So different various of these processes can integrate a lot of different elements and metals and semiconductors as well, intrinsic semiconductors, but we are going to focus on some of those. So where do we find these minerals? Well, mostly we find them in the ground. And this is a picture of among probably the most important mines for this industry. This is a spruce pine mine in North Carolina, which produces high purity quartz. This quartz is the source of silicon. We really have two sources of this material from very ancient metamorphic rocks with some pegmatitic intrusions in North Carolina. There may be alternative high purity quartz resources in Norway and Thuringia. Silicon is very important because of its thermal stability, because it easily adopts an oxide layer to become an insulating element, and so it remains the main substrate for semiconductors. So as you see here, the dominant production is actually from the United States, which is an unusual situation in mining. We can only think of yet one other critical mineral like this, and that's beryllium, not of any interest for us here today. But you also notice that China is almost non-existent, and this doesn't mean that it doesn't produce silicon. It does, because between mining and the actual production of wafer, a couple of things that need to happen. Of course, the quartz has to be melted, then it undergoes purification, the so-called Siemens process at 2000 degrees centigrade, and then the so-called Czochralski process, invented by accident about 100 years ago. By a Polish engineer in Germany. That is done by basically dipping a seed in molten silicon, and then that forms a single crystal ingot that weighs about 300 kilograms of single crystal silicon, then is sufficient to create about 1,000 wafers, each wafer about 30 centimeters diameter and less than 1 millimeter thickness. But quartz is not the only product that goes into substrate. This is the second one, and this is germanium. Germanium had its day in the sun in semiconductors a couple of years ago. It lost to silicon, not only because silicon is more widely available, but also germanium is not as thermally stable and also had some problems creating efficient oxide layers on it. However, germanium is interesting for certain applications for infrared optics, and China is a dominant player. Actually, there's one mine that's specifically devoted to germanium in Yunnan. It's called Linzang. And as you see, China controls about 60% of the production of germanium. But it's possible to produce germanium as a byproduct of zinc mines, especially mesothermal zinc, as in Peru or in Canada/Alaska. So there are ways to extract it. That particular mine in China is actually a lignite coal deposit interlayered with some limestone. And a similar deposit actually exists in Bulgaria, but it's not exploited. There are other compound wafers. So silicon and germanium are examples of simple semiconductors. So intrinsic semiconductor elements that are used for chip production, but some others are compounds. So you combine several different elements together, for example, from the 13th and 15th column in the table of elements. That will be the case, for example, of gallium arsenide or indium phosphide or gallium nitride. Why do we need those? Well, we need those because they have slightly different characteristics than silicon. For example, they have a wider band gap, which means that they are more efficient in high temperature or with high voltage. So it makes them very useful for power electronics, sometimes for optoelectronics as well. So gallium arsenide will have many more mobile electrons than silicon. Can be used also for telecommunication devices, for LiDAR or radar, and so on. And gallium actually is usually produced from bauxite, so it's a byproduct of alumina refining. Karst bauxite is the best, such as found in Iran or Eastern Mediterranean, but China is a dominant player of gallium production, importing lateritic bauxite, mostly from Guinea, as Chinalco, state-owned company Chinalco does, but also from Australia. There's another compound, gallium nitride, which also is characterized by very wide band gap, and it's used for power electronics. Another type of substrate is high purity alumina. Here, there's another Chinese company that dominates this space because, of course, you need alumina also to create this purified material, usually through Bayer process and some further purification, fractional crystallization, or electrolysis. And there are also other sources of this. It doesn't have to be alumina, it could be some kaolin, clay, or some industrial feedstock. Why is it important for semiconductors? Because it's the best source of synthetic sapphire. And synthetic sapphire is really important for both optoelectronics and power electronics. And that's because this product, the high purity alumina that's used for sapphire production, has high thermal conductivity and relative electric insulation, which makes it quite unique. China, again, is a dominant producer, though there is production of this product both in North America, France, and Australia. Indium, another ingredient of compound wafers, especially indium phosphide and indium antimonides. This one is characterized by very, very high electron velocity, and it's used mostly for LEDs, so light emitting diodes. It can be found with sphalerite, which is the main mineral, which is a source of zinc, in skarns or in skarns with zinc, or porphyries as well. In China, there are mines in Guangxi and Yunnan. Indium phosphide substrate is used mostly for infrared optics. And here's bismuth. Bismuth can also be used as a substitute for silicon, mostly as bismuth telluride. It's a very unusual material because it's diamagnetic, which means it resists magnetization. It has also low conductivity, both thermal and electric. So it's used for thermoelectronic cooling devices. It can be found in hydrothermal veins, for example, with tungsten, and in granite intrusions with silver, zinc, and also in intrusion-related gold. Okay, so once we have a substrate ready, let's say the substrate is a silicon substrate. The first thing that will happen once you have generated that wafer, it actually has to undergo a process called epitaxy. So in this case, silicon gases are heated, and atoms of silicon are again deployed on top of the wafer to align with the existing crystalline structure. It makes it a very pure, very smooth product, which is then oxidized for insulation. And then we'll start seeing further processes: deposition, chemical, mechanical planarization, lithography, etching, and doping. So for deposition, there are three types of materials that can be deposited. One are dielectrics, so insulators such as hafnium, about which I'll speak in a moment. Another one are metals, mostly for creating conductive pathways, but also metals as barrier metals to insulate certain metals from the silicon substrate, because sometimes certain atoms can migrate or be diffused and in a way prevent silicon from functioning properly as a semiconductor. Hafnium is popular in high-K metal gates, introduced in Intel in 2007. This material comes very often as a byproduct of zirconium production in heavy mineral sands deposits, but also in pegmatites and in carbonatites, such as in Kola Peninsula in Russia. China, again, is dominant, especially in Jiangxi. Jiangxi is one of the centers of mining in China. Then we have platinum. This is from metal deposition, of course, and platinum is very resistant in harsh environments, so very useful for thermal stability. And of course, it can be found mostly in southern Africa and layer magmatic intrusions, but also in primary magmatics in northern Russia, Finland, or Canada, and in hydrothermal magmatics. And here China is not particularly well endowed, as you can see. Nickel is another metal that's used in deposition, usually physical vapor deposition on wafers. This material is used mostly as a diffusion barrier for either copper or aluminum to separate them from silicon. Most production in the world comes, of course, from sulfides, mostly in northern hemisphere, and laterites in higher latitudes. The Chinese number here is in brackets because it doesn't refer really to mining. The main mining center in China is Gansu, but China also controls a lot of refining overseas, predominantly in Indonesia, since the revolution in nickel pig iron laterites some 20 years ago. Here's another metal that's mostly used as a barrier metal, although also appears in gates. This is tantalum, so it separates copper from silicon. Has thermal stability, is highly conductive, also protects the elements from corrosion. Here, again, China is not very dominant. Most of the production comes either from paralkaline or pegmatite deposits and from coltan, so columbite, tantalite, associated with niobium in Rwanda and Democratic Republic of Congo. Titanium, another of those barrier metals, important, very inert metal. Helpful always when metals and metalloids connect, sometimes generating a lot of resistance. So to deal with the power consumption, titanium is interspersed. Most titanium is produced from heavy mineral sands, sedimentary, from rutile mineral specifically, but there are also VTM deposits, so vanadium titanium magnetite, such as in Sichuan in China, and Bahia in Brazil. So again, China is quite dominant in the production of titanium, although there are two markets here, titanium dioxide for paint and titanium sponge metal, which is only less than 10% of the total market. Tungsten. Tungsten is very interesting. TSV stands for through silicon vias. These are deep trenches in the semiconductor that are used for interconnects that are more deeply buried. There are about 17 different layers of metal on a single chip. As we hear that China is the Saudi Arabia of rare earths, it's also Saudi Arabia of tungsten, because you find tungsten tin Greisen, so hydrothermally altered granites in China. You find there skarns with tungsten, you find porphyries. So as you see, there's a lot of concentration of tungsten, but tungsten can be found also elsewhere. There's a new mine being built in South Korea at the moment, and there is also production in Bolivia, Myanmar, and it's possible also to develop projects in North America. It's a very interesting metal because at the same time it's highly conductive, but its atoms are not easily dislodged because of a strong metallic bonding that tungsten benefits from. Cobalt. Cobalt is a little rare. Cobalt intellectually, not until Applied Materials replaced copper in certain semiconductors a couple of years ago because copper was too reactive and too intrusive. And most cobalt is sourced as a byproduct of either copper in Central Southern Africa or as a byproduct of nickel production in Indonesia, although the main cobalt only mine comes from a 5-element epithermal called Bouazer in Morocco. And again, the number here for China refers to refining of cobalt, not mining. Now we're moving to lithography. So lithography depends on focusing ultraviolet light, actually ultraviolet laser, onto a the wafer that's protected with a photoresist made of a resin. That resin is made from it's a polymer, so it's not doesn't involve mining or materials made from mining. However, the mask through which that beam of laser has to go through is reliant on several metals. This is a case here of DUV, so deep ultraviolet photomask requires chromium. Chromium absorbs that light, and it functions as a kind of a stencil through which that pattern will be projected on photoresist, making those exposed parts soluble, which subsequently are removed by another chemical, exposing certain parts of the wafer for metal deposition and other treatment later on. Chromium comes mostly from stratiform deposits, such as in Southern Africa, and some polyphenophilitic deposits in other parts of the world. However, as the size of semiconductors has been miniaturized in recent years, we moved from deep ultraviolet to extreme ultraviolet lithography that requires different photomasks, and these photomasks use molybdenum rather than chromium because molybdenum doesn't absorb UV, it reflects it. Molybdenum can be produced as a byproduct of a lot of copper porphyries, but they're also molybdenum-specific porphyries, such as the Climax mine in Colorado, and there are also these types of deposits in China, mostly in places such as Anhui and Jiangxi. There are also, molybdenum can be also associated with tungsten porphyries. Also related to lithography is tin, for a slightly different reason. So tin is a source of the very beam. How does it happen? A laser, such as, for example, yttrium aluminum garnet laser containing rare earths, yttrium, is used to bombard molten tin thousands of times per second, and that molten tin will then be turned into plasma, which emits that EUV light. Tin is produced from a variety of tungsten tin porphyries and skarns. There are a lot of those in China. It's actually similar to the tungsten endowment in China, but in Southeast Asia, it's also produced from alluvial placers. And then we're moving to etching. Etching relies on removing the material that was previously exposed to photolithography in order to open it to further treatment, for example, deposition of metals or doping with ions. And for that, there can be dry etching or wet etching. In dry etching, dry plasma etching, we use certain gases containing fluorine gas or fluoride compounds, so fluoride with nitrogen, sulfur, or carbon. Because these fluoride compounds, they interact very easily with silicon-based materials, so easily made volatile fluorides that can be then removed through this process. Fluorspar can be found in carbonate replacement deposits in with hydrothermal veins. A lot of those in China, for example, in Xinjiang, but the main producer these days is Mexico, and there's a new mine being built currently in Utah. But as you see, China still dominates fluorspar production. So while fluorspar was useful for etching of silicon, you still remember that there are some compound substrates, and for these, boron can be useful, boron trichloride. That's, for example, for etching of gallium arsenide or gallium nitride. It's also useful to etch away aluminum if there is any. This trichloride reacts very strongly with oxide. It can be found in volcanosedimentary deposits, for example, in Western Turkey. There's also a deposit in Serbia, although it's currently mothballed by a major UK-listed company that is trying to develop it for something like 20 years now. There's also a lithium boron deposit in Nevada, currently with the progress blocked by the courtrooms. Then we're moving to doping. Doping, for example, through ion implantation, consists in essentially bombarding the substrate of the semiconductor with ions. Ions of those elements that have different number of electrons than silicon. So, for example, N dopers and dopants have more electrons that donate one, and the P dopants, they borrow one and create those holes on the conduction on the valence band of the atom. Antimony is one of the N dopers alongside phosphorus and arsenic, and it can be found in sedimentary hosted deposits or carbonate hosted deposits. So sediments in this case would be sandstone, for example, or shale. Again, China is a very dominant miner. The largest antimony mine is located in Hunan. But there are also, interesting enough, a lot of antimony gold deposits associated with gold quartz shear zones, and that helps the Western companies to redevelop these deposits. It's easier for bankers to back gold-related or gold byproduct deposits, as is the case in Eastern Australia or in Idaho, for example, in the United States. Another doping material, tellurium. Tellurium usually comes as a byproduct of electrolytic copper production, but there are also dedicated mines to tellurium. And again, you won't be surprised to find out that there are in China and Sichuan. Otherwise, you have to look for epithermals with gold and maybe volcano. The VMS deposits with copper. This doping material is mostly for the indium gallium arsenide substrate rather than for silicon, and it enhances conductivity as the doping ions usually do. Okay, we arrived at rare earths. So rare earths also can be used for doping. A lot of rare earths are used for doping because of their optoelectronic abilities. So terbium is one of them. Terbium can actually emit green light, but some of the rare earths can also enhance electroluminescence of other materials. So, for example, europium, which in itself is a phosphor. So, when excited with energy, electrons go to a higher energy level. When they go down, they start emitting photons. In the case of europium in the visible spectrum, that will be red color. In the case of cerium, the light lanthanide, that would be blue. But the same europium can be used to increase luminescence of chalcogens, so say tellurium, cellium, or sulfur. In the case of cerium, that would be zinc oxide or titanium dioxide. Here on this map, we kind of reproduce a lot of different potential projects in rare earths. Of course, China is still a dominant producer from, as we would say normally, in iron ore business in Brazil. There's a northern system and southern system. Northern system in Inner Mongolia, southern system in the Yangtze Craton, and mostly with ionic clays. And ionic clays are a better source of heavy rare earths, to which terbium belongs. We marked here also those projects which are not ionic rare earths, but they're also potentially rich in terbium, as is the case of one project in Namibia, one in Northern Australia, one in Brazil, potentially one in Wyoming and Norway. This is not a call on their economic viability. It's only what's in the ground in situ. This is just to recap their capacity of the rare earths to function as the doping ions, acting as phosphorus or as sort of enhancers of phosphorus. But there are other roles that are important for rare earths in production of semiconductors. First and foremost, they function as lasers. I already mentioned the yttrium aluminum garnet laser, and yttrium is a rare earth element, not a lanthanide, but associated geologically. And sometimes that laser is also doped with neodymium, light rare earth, to produce the ultraviolet light in lithography. It's also this laser that's used to bombard that molten tin, as I mentioned before. Sometimes carbon dioxide lasers are used instead of those rare earth lasers, but they generate carbon oxide byproduct, which has to be dealt with, and that's also, in this case, we have to use one of the rare earths, lanthanum, and lanthanum strontium cobalt compound to combat that. Yttrium is also useful for plasma control, first for the plasma etching chambers to protect it against high temperature radiation. We also use yttrium, so this is for yttrium oxide. For plasma control, we also need magnetic fields, so the magnets, such as the neodymium iron boron magnets, are really important. And if we're talking about magnets, it's also important to keep in mind that a lot of the machinery in a semiconductor foundry, such as in Taiwan, depends on those magnets for magnetic levitation. So a lot of machinery there's no physical contact. So there's a lot of frictionless, contactless presence as these different parts moving in lithography or in metal deposition, whether physical vapor deposition or atomic layer deposition or chemical vapor deposition. This is where the magnets are absolutely necessary. Some of these magnets are apparently also the cobalt samarium magnets. Two other uses mentioned here: CMP, which is chemical mechanical planarization, that requires cerium oxide. Cerium, a very abundant light lanthanide. This is to smoothen the surface of a wafer and to remove any unwanted metals. For example, leave only those that were left in the patterned area after lithography. And this is something that keeps coming back in the process of production, the CMP. And finally, capacitors. So capacitors are not transistors per se, but they're parts of the integrated circuits to store and manage energy necessary. Historically, there are a lot of different solutions for capacitors, but ceramics are often used, and dysprosium, the heavy rare earth, is increasingly used in those capacitors to increase the dielectric abilities of barium titanite. Dysprosium is highly valued because, just as we know from magnet production, it performs very well in high temperatures. Last but not least, two words about the equipment. Just like I mentioned about the magnets, graphite is important because of its very uniform thermal expansion coefficient and uniform thermal behavior in general. So it's highly valued in different elements of the equipment, including photolithography steppers. It's also, by the way, the crucible in which the Nadrowski process creates those single crystal silicon ingots. However, although this map shows natural graphite, a lot of graphite used in semiconductor production is actually synthetic. There's no need for flaky graphite here. There's no need to spherinize. So this is not like in anode production for batteries. And the final word about testing equipment. So APT, assembly, testing, and packaging is a separate part of the entire value chain in semiconductor production. But of course, that also requires a lot of different minerals. This is one that didn't appear in our foundry fabrication part. Uranium, which is a byproduct of a byproduct usually, so byproduct of molybdenum produces a byproduct of copper. China used to export this, it stopped exporting, but it's available from mines in Chile, which have molybdenum byproduct, but even from a copper mine in Poland, which doesn't, but has some molybdenite from which it produces uranium. It's also possible to produce it from certain deposits in the US. What is it for? Essentially for those little needles that are important to test the semiconductors, because it's a material with high conductivity and very good spring capacity. And so we're not going to go into this, but just to show you that a lot of major metals also appear in the process of packaging. Okay, back to you, Stuart.
Tomasz, so as you might have seen from this presentation, we've covered 31 different minerals here. And After selecting a mineral that we're interested in, we screen the global geological endowment for that mineral and projects with known discoveries of that mineral. A lot of the time, the mineral deposits contain a number of elements and metals, so we need to see what the primary commodity composition is. We then run a screen to see if the company is reliant on the Chinese supply chain between the mine and the final product. And we also need to see where that product's going to and do assessment on the customers. We then need to look into the metallurgy of the project to see if there are any possibility that the minerals will be extracted and separated from the rock ore. This can often be a project killer. There is an old saying that geologists discover mines and metallurgists kill mines. For non-producing mining companies, we run a relative value screen based on the resource or reserve size and including drill results. For the producers, we run a relative value screen based on earnings multiples and also price and net asset value. For a company that has good quality projects with a commodity that is in the doldrums, it is still possible to generate a positive return for investors, depending where that company and project sits on the Lassonde curve. We have conducted due diligence on over 100 mines spanning 6 continents over the years. This hands-on field experience cannot be replaced. Recently, Tomasz and I went to Malawi, Africa, and visited a rare earths project, a graphite titanium project, and a uranium mine. And now we'll pass on to Q&A, so don't forget you can submit questions through the chat function on the right. And this will be available for replay using the same link later today, and then also on our website. We have one question, Tomasz, come in. It's about cesium. So wondering, what, if any, role does cesium play in semiconductors or circuits? And does most of the cesium come from China?
So yes, yes to the second, and not so much to the first question. A company called Sino-Mine controls much of the cesium production, including in Canada, by the way. So that stems still from a time where these markets were open to Chinese mining investment. This might change because some of the lithium developers in Canada are finding interesting cesium byproduct. But cesium as such is not commonly used for either deposition or doping or etching or lithography in semiconductor foundry. I think main use remains as an important product for oil drilling, and this will remain to be so. So it's an important element, but just not in this value chain at the moment.
Yeah. And then also, what technologies are being used to enhance the exploration phase, i.e. artificial intelligence, machine learning tools, to find all the rare earths and critical minerals as we go deeper into the ground subsurface? So I'll comment on that, that has been useful in collating all the information you're getting from geochemistry, samples, mapping, and drilling, and just to process that to find coincident anomalies. So that's been definitely useful. The AI machine learning hasn't really helped, from my understanding, enabled humans to go deeper through the ground and subsurface. That'd be more physical properties of exploration tools. And Tomasz, if you have anything else to add on that?
Yeah, this is actually a very interesting question. So for machine learning, you need to feed the machine with a lot of data, and the data has to be problem specific. That is a bit of a hurdle in mineralogy. It's not like an aquatic environment. This is not a liquid. This is not a hydrocarbon element. So, how useful are data from certain analog deposit found on another continent to feed it into the machine so that it can process more easily your new data coming from, say, a project in Canada or somewhere. It would require a lot of centralization of this data, because the machine learning is only as good as what you feed them with, so that they can start actually generating their own patterns, pattern recognition. But that's still very, very site-specific, as we know for now. So I don't know who's doing work which is kind of larger, at a larger scale. Is any of the advanced countries actually going into this and feeding all the data from national knowledge like USGS here in the United States into some machine. I have not heard of that, but it would be a good idea because it would speed up that process. Definitely the industry is way behind schedule on finding a breakthrough to fast track these processes. This is still a very sequential work and still sending stuff for assay, and during booms in the market, the assay labs are full and you wait for weeks, sometimes months. So we're not there yet.
Yeah, I mean, the best thing in the rare earths would be, using this or steps to, speeding up the production process. There's about 940 steps from mining rare earth rich rock to getting final oxide products. And then on that topic of rare earths, another question came in about MP materials, and someone was asking if that was the most important project out there for rare earths to semiconductors.
Okay, well, we will try not to maybe comment on specific securities if you allow us, but let me just step back and say something different. The move of the US government regarding this project, which has been around for decades, is positive in one way. It sent a signal to the market that we're taking deficiencies in this value chain very seriously. And certain elements of that deal last summer were actually very positive for the entire market, not least, of course, the announcement of the price floor for the product, the light or rare earths that would be produced from Mountain Pass one day. That's a signal for the entire market. So it's very positive. On the other hand, when it comes to the process of favoring this company versus that company, we're not in the room. We don't know how that works. We would hope normally as taxpayers that this process is as rigorous as the one that Stuart just mentioned for an investment by a private party. But we don't know that.
Yeah, and one thing is just look at the basket composition of the deposit, and every rare earth deposit has a unique kind of breakdown composition of the different rare earth elements.
Yeah, so very quickly to add up on it, and a couple of things to look at, of course. This is very different from other minerals. It's not just a question of grade and width to mine and depth and SG, specific gravity. It is also the distinctive part is the breakdown of different elements out of the 15 plus 2 elements. How does it show, whether there are any heavies there, whether those heavies would be economic to develop, and of course also the byproducts, because there is association with radionuclides for certain deposits, especially thorium and uranium, and that ratio of these radionuclides to the total rare earth oxide in situ is an important ratio to look into. So there are a couple of levers there in addition to the typical questions that you would ask as a mining investor.
Yeah, and then another one on silicon vapor or nickel vapor. Are they really gases or particulate matter?
Silicon vapor.
Vapor, yeah.
So silicon tetrachloride is the gas that's used for epitaxy on top of the silicon wafer, and that decomposes in high temperature to recreate that single crystal layer on top. And that's sort of the last thing you do before oxidization. So it's a tetrachloride that's used for that. For most of the dopants, what's used is ions, and also etching. Dry etching is done with plasma, so gases which are then excited with either high temperature or high radiation or electrons to turn into a plasma. So ionized gas, it's what's used for anything, fluorides, oxychlorides, chlorides, and so on.
Then has the need for certain minerals encouraged silver mining?
Yes, I mean, we hoped so when the solar industry exploded, because it's an important element of this, alongside cadmium, tellurium, and some other germanium, some other elements. But silver remains first and foremost an investment product, just like gold. And people invest in silver predominantly as an asset in itself, not as an industrial product. So it has those two lives. And I think until we find a use that's very dominant in volume terms and in value terms, I think silver will still remain more of an investment good per se than an industrial metal, even though it has a number of industrial applications.
Yeah, and compared to gold, where some of the deposits, the Stibnite projects are kind of gold rich, particularly in these prices. It's it's a gold project first with antimony second, but sometimes badged as an antimony project. And yeah, so don't forget to send any other questions over. And then Tomasz, which types of, back to the maps you had, which minerals, if you could summarize, is the West kind of at the forefront of bringing back its market share? Like antimony, for example, a few more products are getting up online compared to ones at the back end.
Yeah, definitely antimony sees some action, tungsten as well. Rare earths, obviously. I mean, a very important, systemically vital company, Australian-listed company, separated dysprosium, heavy rare earth, in Malaysia earlier this year. This is a quantum leap for the West, for the non-Chinese value chain. So this is really happening. I think in several of those that could be obtained as a byproduct. So example here would be gallium or germanium or rhenium, of course, and some others. There's also progress, but that requires involvement from larger operating companies that have refining capability, especially in zinc and alumina refining. And rather than sending, say, bauxite from Australia to process some of this bauxite into alumina and use this additional flow of, in this case, gallium, that will be very helpful. And of course, people are thinking about it, and we saw some action politically between Australia and US to achieve just that. And there are other projects in Canada going in the same direction. So yes, there is a movement, and there has to be, because I think we've gone through enough blackmail by Beijing in terms of how they weaponize those materials. So I think enough of wake-up calls and time to wake up, get up, and start walking.
And mining. So on the artificial intelligence, back onto that topic. So any comments on cobalt metals? And then I understand that Vorticity takes a continental approach, taking in tens of variables as part of its simulations, including the usage of the USGS data feeds, which they receive. By continental approach, they look at North America, for example, copper, and then focus on regions that could be rich in copper. These regions might not necessarily be states such as Arizona and New Mexico, which are traditionally known for copper deposits, and could be other states or parts of the United States that have not necessarily been tapped. They use geoscientists and geologists as part of this process, and yeah, they're learning more about this process, but interested to hear what we had to say on that.
Well, I was not aware of this. It's very interesting, and thank you for the comment. I think it's encouraging that someone has taken initiative. The question, of course, is who this data, the data obtained this way, will be available to, and at what cost.
Yeah, I'm familiar with a company, not Cobalt Metals, but it's in the hydrogen space. It's a different name. Has similar shareholders though, and they keep a very tight lip onto all the information they have from their exploration and also their artificial intelligence ventures.
Oh, I know. So this was about Cobalt.
Yes, Cobalt, the private company,
yes,
Bill Gates and
right.
Breakthrough Venture-backed company.
Yeah, of course.
So yeah, I think it's time to end the presentation and work to a close. So I thank everyone for joining today and hope you found it informative. And as I mentioned earlier, this will be available by the link you use to sign up for the webinar, and then it will be available on our website for replay. And feel free to reach out to us anytime. Our website's www.amvestterraden.com, and you can find links to contact us there. We thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.